It's 9 minutes past 8 o'clock. We know that South Africa is one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal society when it comes to income. But a new study is shining some light on how little progress has been made to close that gap since 1994. It looks at inherited wealth, and it clearly shows that black South Africans have little to pass on in terms of generational wealth onto loved ones. Study finding that 45% of white South African adults own inheritable wealth of at least 250,000 Rand, compared to 3% of black South Africans, 9% of colored South Africans, and 23% of Asian South Africans. These gaps have narrowed only modestly between 2009 and 2019, says researchers, including one of them, Dr. Rebecca Simson, a lecturer in economic and social history at Oxford University. Good morning, Rebecca. Really appreciate your time. Talk to me about this study and what structural and policy factors that have contributed to the slow pace of wealth redistribution in post-apartheid South Africa.
Good morning, Lester. It's great to be here and great to be here on the show. So thanks so much for that introduction. So as you mentioned, I'm here to talk about some recent work on racial wealth inequality that I've been working on with a colleague at the London School of Economics, Mina Mahmoudzadeh. So this is primarily, I would say, a paper about data and about numbers. And if I can hold your question for a moment and just tell you a little bit, perhaps, about where those numbers come from and how to interpret them, because I think that's sort of important for context. So what we wanted to do here was to provide some sort of new insights on racial wealth inequality in post-apartheid South Africa. And we're proposing to do that by looking at racial composition of people who are leaving assets at death, and particularly those who are leaving estates, so wealth that's being passed on as inheritance of at least 250,000 Rand. So what we'd argue is that this is perhaps we can think of as a sort of middle class or upper middle class sort of wealth threshold that gives us a sort of picture of what this sort of middle class wealth strata perhaps looks like. And it's important to say that inheritance data, information from probated administration systems, is quite often used for studies of wealth inequality because it's one of the few moments in the lifetime where people's sort of full portfolios of wealth are being reported and recorded in a systematic way. So it gives us snapshots that allow us to sort of reconstruct and think about the distribution of wealth, which isn't very easy to do from other types of sources. You've mentioned our sort of headline figures. I thought perhaps I could start with what's in a way the sort of conceptually easiest measure that we use, which is just a measure of the share of people dying who are leaving wealth of at least 250,000 Rand. And we can look at that ratio for different racial groups. So we estimate that in 2009, it's about 62% of white South Africans who are dying, who are leaving wealth above this threshold. It's about 42% for Asian South Africans, about 15% for colored South Africans, and about 5% for black South Africans. And then we do some further calculations to make some estimates of what the wealth on the basis of that is likely to look like for the adult population as a whole.
Yeah.
Given that the wealth of the dying is typically a bit higher than for adults as a whole. So our main contribution here is to sort of add some new numbers and a new way of estimating or measuring the racial wealth divide in South Africa.
But do you look at how a post-apartheid dispensation has done in firstly growing a middle class, and particularly a black middle class, and
Mm,
how that transfers into leaving some form of generational wealth?
mm,
There's some mixed numbers here. The ANC claims that the middle class Black middle class has grown to some 6 million people by 2018. They haven't provided some form of real statistical backing there, but it's generally understood that there are about 3.4 million people in South Africa, black South Africans, who would be considered middle class. This is only about 7% of the overall black African population. We have deep inequality, wealth inequality in South Africa. Half of the country lives off a monthly income of about 2,100 rand. But what have been some of the effectiveness of policies like broad-based back economic empowerment, affirmative action, land reform in addressing this
Mhm.
racial wealth divide?
Those are big and very, very important questions. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to speak to all of them. So we're not really evaluating those policies in this research. But what I can say is that one part of the analysis looked at the geographic distribution of these estate holders. So we mapped basically the residences of estate holders, people with leaving 250,000 rand of assets geographically, and looked specifically at Black South African estate holders in this bracket. And what it showed was that about 40 to 50% of these estate leavers were resident in townships at their death. Because this sort of wealth bracket, the main asset people are likely to be passing on in this wealth bracket is their home, right? Around
Mm,
the world. Sort of the main source of wealth, the biggest asset that the kind of middle class tend to own is their home, right?
mm,
So it gives us some clue to what assets people are passing on. Right? And what we suggest, and this is drawing on some other work by the anthropologist Max Bolt at Oxford, is that actually the privatization of township housing has
mm,
actually been quite an important um, part of of sort of the stock of wealth that people have been accumulating in the last 20, 30 years. So that it's actually that transfer of wealth in the late 80s, 90s that I think has been quite underplayed, or
mm,
certainly not researched very much in South Africa. That seems to be accounting for
mm,
quite a lot of the
mm,
wealth of the generation of Black South Africans who are passing today.
mm. Do you make any recommendations in terms of the challenges highlighted in the study?
Mm-hmm.
What should be a policy approach in particularly in respect to private property rights? There has been a very slow program of handing over title deeds to, as you say, township
Mm-hmm.
RTP houses, even old rental stock, which has been in place since before 1994, in a very slow process of handing over the deed of that particular property. Do you
Mm-hmm.
make any recommendations in that regard, and on how we maybe grow this particular segment of the South African demography
Mm-hmm.
to add to a transfer of generational wealth, in this case, as you say, primary centered around property?
Mm. Um, I mean, so what these findings are suggesting is that these handing over, or sometimes often sales as well, of deeds to township housing, for instance, has been important for middle class wealth accumulation. So, from that perspective, I'd probably say that's something to look into if that could continue or be speeded up. I clearly one of the intentions I understand as well is for beneficiaries of RDP housing to get formal titles to those properties that would allow them to trade them and use them as a sort of stepping stone on the property market.
Mm,
Um, I don't want to say too much about
mm,
recommendations. I'm sorry. I don't think that's really what we set out to do. And I think that's ultimately sort of a question for
yeah.
debate for South Africans to have. What I would say is that coming sort of from the outside, there's a lot that's still shared in this story with many other countries around the world today. I think it's probably more acute in South Africa. But around the world, there are a lot of concerns about growing wealth inequities and about the difficulty of first-time buyers to enter the property market because property prices have risen much faster than incomes in many parts around the world for the last 30 or so years. So there's a lot of debate everywhere about the types of policies that help to broaden that, allow people to acquire homes, and they may sound quite boring, but they have a lot to do with interest rates, with
So,
getting
so
more
in your broader expertise of being a economist slash social historian, do we often fudge the definitions of when we say generational wealth and when the wealth means abundance? But instead of talking about simply just middle class safety nets. I'm a middle
Yeah.
class South African who has
Mm.
middle class parents. If I were to completely mess up the likelihood that I will be caught by some sort of generational safety net is
Yeah.
largely a better descriptor of someone saying generational wealth, because then you somewhat seem as if you have just bank accounts and trusts and large scale earths that will be
You're right.
transferred. It's not about that. It's simply having a social safety net that if something were to happen to me or when my parents pass on, there's a general safety net that would catch me, and in turn that will catch my children. And not talking about these generations of simply, obtained wealth. I don't think that's
Mm.
what we mean when we talk about the transfer of generational wealth.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the word wealth probably has a lot of sort of emotional associations. I mean, the way economists mean wealth is simply um, a storer of resources, and what we're talking about here, right, is absolutely what you're onto. This idea of some resources to fall back on, and the reason we should care about it is because there's a lot of research to show that having that type of safety net makes a big difference to lived outcomes, to people's ability to make choices, economic choices in their lives.
Rebecca Simson, have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you so much for your time lecturing economic and social history at Oxford University.